Okay. Well, we are here. We're going to get started. Glad everybody's here today. Welcome back to the People's African History class here at Cafe Resistance. We do this every first and third Saturday, 1 to 3 p.m. Hopefully, you're open to the community, right? I think I see you using, of course, my brother. But a couple new faces, I think maybe out there before maybe not. But thank y'all for coming. Again, please spread the word. This is something that we're doing in the first time. I think the first time was June, so we've been doing this for about 6 months. Yeah, so we're gonna keep rolling. That's this the first, and not this the third Saturday. That is the plan to keep this going. The last time when we were here, we talked about the transatlantic slave trade. So if you've been here for the past couple of months, you know that we start all the way back from the beginning of time. Because as you know, our bloodline and our heritage and our history was all the way back to the beginning, right? Whether you believe in evolution, whether you believe in the creation story, Black people start from the beginning. So that's where we start. We talk about our history. And we talked about Africa, we talked about Egypt as a cradle civilization, how we came from the central and southern parts of Africa, how we migrated to other parts of the world. We talked about the African presence in Europe, African presence in Asia, all over everywhere. So if you've been here, you know, we talked about how we created science and math. We talked about the pyramids. We talked about the Black family. We had all these various topics. And so now we are about halfway. We typically try to go through our entire history all the way up until the present day. And so that usually takes about a year. So that's why we're about halfway through it. Since we've been doing this for 6 months, we're about a halfway mark. And that's when we start to talk about the transatlantic slave trade and how we got to the Americas. And then we go deeper into the African American story and the African Caribbean story, because that's when you start to learn about the Haitian Revolution. That's when you learn about slavery and emancipation, so-called emancipation. We start going into those stories there for the last half of the year. So with that being said, that's where we are now. So we talked about the transatlantic slave trade. The time before that, we discussed Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. So we talked about the major West African kingdoms. And those were the last of those African kingdoms before the Europeans came, at least on the western part of Africa when the Europeans came, and that's when the slave trade, really started to take off. The transatlantic, the Arab slave trade was already going on at that time. So we started there, and now we're going to continue with that and go into the Middle Passage. So with that being said, I would also like to remind you, if you can make it, we do go live at least every time that I'm here. If we have a guest lecture, we're not able to go live, but I'm here. We go live, so if you can make it, you can always go to our YouTube page. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, I Say Institute, and there you'll see, whenever we go live, it'll pop up on your YouTube. You can always just listen live as well. And so, what I like to always start off with, why is cutting off right here? It's kind of cutting off a little bit here. I don't know. But anyway, but I always like to start off by saying the reason why, we call this the People's African History class, because of course we always have new people. So I like to remind them of kind of the theme and purpose of the class. The reason why we call it the People's African History class is because it is a class, and this is information that is for Black people by Black people, right? So it's not including all other, groups, and what we got to talk about, this group, and each and everything about every single group in the world. We're not doing that. That's how this is, right? Obviously, we do have to talk about other people and include other histories and cultures, because you cannot talk about one without the other. Although, for some reason, white folks think that that's the case, but you have to include other groups. But this group focuses on African people of African descent, people across the African diaspora. We are here to learn from each other, so although I'm here to facilitate the discussion and the teaching, the lecture, I'm sure know things that I know things that you don't know. One person may know something that the other person doesn't know. So feel free to share. If there's something about the topic, or this sparked something that you may have read or saw or came into contact with, by all means share your thoughts, your opinions, things that you know, because this is a collective learning process, okay? And the purpose of this knowledge is to uplift all Black people. So that's why I say this is the people's class. It's not for certain groups. It's not for working class, middle class, or Black people in the north, Black people from the south, Black people that got money, or Black people that's working day to day. Or this is for all of us. Right? We are all one community. We are all together. And like family behavior said, we are all in this bag together. No matter where you're from, no matter what your history is, what your knowledge base is, when you've been learning this stuff for decades since you was a kid, when you just picked up a book yesterday. It don't matter. This is for all of us, because all of us suffer from the same afflictions, suffer from the same issues in this society. So this is for all of us, for our entire community. So feel free to raise your hand or jump in with the discussion. That's what this is about. And when we learn about Black history, from Africa to the United States, we learn about that all around the world. So again, that's why I say African history. It doesn't just mean we're only learning about people on the continent. We're learning about all of us. And when I say African history, I'm talking about people across the diaspora. So we're learning about African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, Haitians, Jamaicans, Africans, Afro-British, everywhere, right? We're talking about all of us. So currently, we're getting ready to go more into the African American story, because that's when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and where our kind of specific history begins. But we started long before there was even an Americans, right? Because we existed long before there was an Americans. Okay? So with that being said, what's the wrong one? Sorry. This is the older version. Let me see if I can find the newer one. Let's see. I think this is the one right here. Okay, here we go. So, all right, yeah, my apologies. Okay, this is it. So we started here. Yes. So now we're going to go into the African Holocaust, and today we're going to talk about the Middle Passage. So this story of the transatlantic slave trade is what we call the Ma'afa. Has anybody ever heard of this term, Ma'afa? Okay, so the Ma'afa, what is, you know what that means?
I can't remember what it means, but I don't know. I heard it, but I can't remember.
Yeah, like the Great Disaster is what it means. It's like the Great Disaster. Another term that historians call this is the African Holocaust, right? Typically, when we think about the Holocaust, what do we think about? Jews, right? The Jewish Holocaust that was said to have happened in Germany. And so this obviously predates that, right? So also what I always encourage people to do is sign the sign-in sheet so you can get on the email list so that you'll be reminded of the weekends that we have these classes, and so that you can spread it. You can tell other people about what we have going on here at Character Resistance. And so again, please feel free to sign the sign-in sheet so we can stay in contact with you. So, to start from just to kind of do a quick recap, we talked about the transatlantic slave trade and how it was this forced movement of an estimated, and this is very conservative numbers on here, 10 to 12 million African people. But we've heard of numbers all the way up to 50 million and up, right? I think this is just people trying to be nice, right? 10 to 20 million African people to the Americas between the 15th and the 19th centuries. Right? Like most strangers to Africa, the Arabs entered Africa allegedly as friends, and then of course that slave trade began hundreds and hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade. That's the slave trade we typically know about, right? The slave trade started when the Europeans began to expand into the broader world, and the market for slaves was created by Europeans for European visas. So it's important for us to know that, and we did talk about this before as well, that the slave trade included African people, African rulers who participated in the slave trade, but many of them did that not with the intention of these people being enslaved forever. It was what they thought was the indentured servitude. They had no idea that it was this kind of, it was shadow slavery, right? Which is what we call this portion of slavery, where you are literally less than human. You are treated as less than human, as less than animal. You are treated as if you are possession, right? As if you're not even a human being. And so this has never been done before, especially to this level in history. And so a lot of times when we talk about African people being involved, again, they didn't see themselves as connected to these other people that they were selling, because these weren't people that were part of their village, right? Just like white folks didn't see each other as one, right? You had French, you had British, you had Germans, you had Spanish, right? Spaniards. Just like they didn't see themselves as one, African people didn't see themselves as one people, right? Because the idea of race has existed at the time. Now we understand ourselves as black, right, as one people, but this is in the 21st century mindset, right? So we have to keep these things in mind when miseducation trying to blame us for slavery, trying to blame African people or black people for their own enslavement. And it's like, no, you can't absolve yourself from the responsibility of what you did to an entire group of people, right? So this is very, very important. Now, with that being said, what do you see up here on this side? Movies. What are these movies about?
Slavery.
Slave depiction. Will Smith, Emancipation. Roots. How many of y'all have seen any or all of these movies up here? Okay. Roots. Mm-hmm. Birth of a Nation, that is the word about next time. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about these films or films that depict African American enslavement?
We are always in a losing state.
Okay, so
they want us to think that our history starts with slavery, but it does not.
right. Right.
Just eliminating that stuff here. And I'm 7 years old.
Yes.
But I'm not.
Yeah, we're learning it now, and that's why we have this. This is why we work for the capital existence to have this so our children can say we had something that taught us this at an early age. You want to say something as well?
I was going to say that most of the movies, it always shows us in a losing state.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, someone always owns us, you always running for something. Like, you never feel like you owning violence in the world. It's always someone having. So it's like imagery, and that's what society.
Yes, absolutely. Right? So just like always showing you at the bottom.
Yeah.
If you're constantly seeing images and seeing yourself as being oppressed, or somebody being over you, you have to sit around and wait for somebody to say it, right? Anybody else, what are your thoughts? Do you think we have too many of these movies?
Hey, yeah.
You think we have too many?
I don't get that time. Can't watch it.
You'll watch it no longer? Gotcha. Okay. So we have a lot of movies that depict us as enslaved people. And if we're honest, yes, this is a part of our story. And this is a part of our story that we should know. But like you said, this is not the only part of our story. Right? And oftentimes this is the story that people like to start, right? To start our story. And this is why for this class we say, and I was taught by people who were taught by A.C.G. Hilliard, which was an African studies professor at the University of Georgia. And he told us, never let them begin your story with slavery. Don't let them begin your history with slavery. It's a part of our story, but this is not our beginning. Because if you tell a little boy or a little girl, this is where you started, you can only go so far from where you went. So this is what they believe they can be, the highest they can be. And so while this is important, it's important for us to know that we have a whole history, thousands and thousands of years before we even got to this. Right? And so this is why it's important.
I was going to say it's more on our minds because like the brain is for images. So it's like they are using our people to show what we did and at the same time keeping us down.
Yes.
Because now it seems more real because it's black actors.
Right. Right. And then typically in these films you typically see who in power. You typically see what folks in power in these films. And so it's just kind of this consistent reminder that keep in mind who's really in charge, right? And so again, that's oftentimes what we see with these slave depictions. And this is why, while sometimes it is important for us to be reminded. We also have to understand that our history is much broader than this, right? And again, this is what we're going to talk about here in this class. Not just talk about slavery, but also so many things around it, the context around it. Not just the beatings, and not just the word or anything like that. There's so much context around it. The first context we're going to talk about is the economy of slavery, right? The economy of slavery. Why is reparations? How many of y'all know what reparations is? Have you heard of reparations? Why is reparations important?
More like due process.
Due process, talk to me about that.
More like like I said, due process. Because we know how it started during the part of basically trying to relinquish from everything and recover from the best attempt at recovering from everything. It was more so the finance reparations is bigger than just finances. Let me say that first. Mm-hmm. And this is more so when foreigners come over here, they have their hand held. And it's like, hey, this is how you maneuver over here in America. This is how you be able to function. This is what you need to learn English, read, write, whatever, schooling, all of that. So basically, when the time came and slavery was ended, throwing us out to the wolves, and all of that. So reparations was part of, like I said, the whole thing, the due process. Okay. So and that was that, because even when slaves was released, slave owners were giving reparations. You know what I'm saying? They was giving back money from they lost property and all of that. So it was more like following this. That's what I'm saying. So that's why reparations, and stuff like that. Even with a lot of people don't see that a form of hurting us, from getting all of that and going through the due process was integration. You know what I'm saying? Because although we got peace from integration, we lost unity and that strong willingness to be on the same page with finishing up due process. You know what I'm saying? With everything, because and basically stuff like that.
I like it. Appreciate it. Anybody else? Why is reparations important?
Pay for the work we did. Pay for what we did.
Pay us for what we did.
He had a head start.
Okay.
Back. Way back. Need more reparations.
Yes, sir.
Well, this country would be financial powerhouse is without centuries of free labor. Free labor. That's the biggest part of it all. You can look at the economy being built on finance. There's a documentary out called King Cloud. You might have seen this. It shows that the amount of money that cotton bought into this nation's economy back during slavery. People don't talk about rice.
Yes, yeah. Rice, sugar.
Yeah. All of those products, the money that flowed into the society from the products, from free labor.
Yes.
All that labor that people.
Yes.
Basically, when you start looking at getting to the Civil War, folks in the North are looking at the South and saying, well, they're prospering from not having
Yeah.
for the labor.
Yes.
But it was what Sherman that came up with the 40 acres and more fuel concept, General Sherman. But that never made it to fruition because of the evolution of chemical early. But no, it's preparation for all the work, all the labor that we did, and all of the inventions that things we invented, processes for labor, new work that was stolen, lost, stolen, or straight.
Yes.
From us.
Yeah.
We're due.
Yeah. And we're going to talk just a little bit. This is just, some of the research that has been done. I'm not a mathematician and all that, so I'm sure you can find people that can break down these numbers even more. This is just a taste of the type of money that was made off of the backs of Black people. And so they say that the investment in slaves was the highest return investment available in the United States in the 19th century. I'm sure the 19th century, 18th, and 17th century. And while railroad investments yielded between 4 and 7% return, the purchase of slaves returned wealth per year between 5 to 9%, all the way up to 14% and 20%, and sometimes even higher. The price of a field hand was on average about $700 in 1828, all the way up to about $1,800 at the time of the Civil War. But the maintenance of maintaining an enslaved person was only about $20 a year. So once you paid for that, after the first year, you had already made your money off of just this one enslaved person. And they obviously, they weren't just enslaved with one person, they had families and families of enslaved people. And it only costs $20 to maintain them over time, right? And right now, we're just talking about the U.S. South. We need to go into the Caribbean. The Caribbean was much more harsh. They actually would rather buy you, and it was cheaper to buy you than to kill you than buy another one than it was to maintain. So we're going to go into that a little bit later. But they say that the starvation level of existence imposed on enslaved Africans can be seen in the development of what we call soul food. So because they didn't want to put in that money to maintain our give us the nutritional value that we needed to perform the labor, that's why we were given the scraps. That's why we were given everything that they didn't want. Not just because they didn't want to eat it, but also because it was cheap. We don't throw this away anyway, so let's just give it to them, and then we took that and we made what? We made soul food, right? We made the things that we eat now. Now we understand also a lot of that really good foods. Things that we eat, that we may eat next week for Christmas, or we probably ate a couple weeks ago for Thanksgiving. Some of that food is not good for us, but this is how we survive, right? And so from the information, it says that to take a broad average of about $250 a year as the amount of wealth that was produced by the African laborers in the years from 1790 till about 1860. We come up with about $19 billion in wealth just in those 60 years. Just in those 60 years, you're talking about $19 billion at that time, right? We can't even imagine what that would be in this time. And so, and the major commodity, what you were talking about, brother, cotton, some of the major commodity crops were tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo, and all of these things were largely created and produced and transported through slave labor. And so the central production of wealth in this country, in the United States and abroad, was slave labor, right? The major commodity, yes, we talked about was sugar and rice. And then in the Caribbean and Brazil and Central America, they were producing the riches of the sugar through the triangular trade, and the estimation of wealth that came out of the Caribbean contributed to about $200 billion of wealth for Europe. $200 billion. Again, this is just from Central America to Europe, right? Not even bringing in the money that was created for America. $30 billion off the sweat of African brows was a surplus that derived from this venture at the time as well. So again, all of this is very, very important because we need to understand exactly how, when we're talking about people are fighting for reparations, people are talking about the study of reparations and how reparations should be given back to Black folks. This is because, like you said, you can't start a number one country. You can't start a leading nation without this type of foundation. You have this type of foundation, yes, you're going to have the greatest military in the world. Yes, you're going to have the greatest education in the world. Yes, you're going to have some of the greatest systems in the world, some of the most leading technology in the world, because you have such an incredible start. Look at how much wealth we've never seen this type of wealth from the start of the country ever in history. Right? So this is the reason why the United States continues to be the number one country in the nation. I'm sorry, it's our number one country in the world. And then some of the systems that started, number one, were the brokers. So you have brokers who were able to then buy African people from the slave trade, from the Middle Passage, and then broker the deals with the plantation owners, right? And so a lot of these brokerage firms that we have now in our country, a lot of brokerage firms that are worth millions and millions of dollars now, they started people. They started brokering African people between plantation owners and those people who were charged with slave ships. And then a lot of our banks, a lot of our early banks started from slave labor. I believe Wells Fargo, if I'm not mistaken, was very much involved in the slave trade. And of course, Wells Fargo went through different names, but if we look at the history of it, it started from banks. Many of our earliest American banks got started with capital funds from slave labor.
In addition to that, all of these firms started with insurance.
Yes, insurance. Absolutely. Much of our insurance companies, absolutely. Much of our insurance companies started right here with slave labor. So again, when we talk about reparations, this thing goes, I don't even think America has enough money to properly, and not just the United States, I'm talking about the United States and Europe. I don't know if they have enough money to properly repair and give back what is owed to African people, not just in the Americas, but in the Caribbean as well, for what we did, and then they capitalize on it, and then maintain over time for centuries and centuries, right? It was something else I saw. Can't remember. Hopefully we'll come back to that. But also, how to understand taxes, right? Taxes on the taxes on the sale of commodities were the main ways that commercial taxes were collected by the state. So a lot of the early states, right, a lot of our cities, even particularly New Orleans was literally built off of the taxes that were paid for each enslaved person. So the taxes that they had to pay on enslaved people, the state collected these taxes, and these taxes were used to build highways, to build some of our major cities in the United States was built off of the taxes of enslaved people, particularly New Orleans. The federal budget made up a smaller percent of many of these city enhancements. Public improvements such as the paving of New Orleans, again, came from these taxes. They said that actually, I want to say the U.S. Budget at the time might have been maybe $17 billion. The economy of slavery created, or property maybe 20-30% more than that. So just from the economy of slavery, we were worth more than the American budget as a whole at the time. So again, we're talking about why reparations is so important. It's because of slave economy, and this is just some wild numbers. We haven't even broken this thing all the way down. America owes us and owes Africa a large debt. The world owes us a large debt for the labor that was done by us to make this simply this world what it is. So again, talking a little bit more about the slave economy. This is just a quick image that shows really exactly how this is pound. This is showing how much money was being made just in this area of the world off of those 400 years of constant slavery, the slave trade, the plantation slave system, and then everything that all of the subsequent systems that were created from that. Again, when we talk about the Middle Passage, we're talking about the number of people that we have. Most of the people that were brought to the Americas from the continent of Africa were right here along the coast, right here along the western part. Sometimes there were some ships that came more over to the eastern part, but most came right from here, from the western part of Africa. And this part right here is called the Middle Passage. Why is this part from the Africa to the Americas called the Middle Passage? Why is this journey right here from Africa to the Americas, why is this called the Middle Passage?
That's the midway between Africa and to the destination.
Okay, so because this is the midway between Africa and the destination, anybody else? what was initially what was this slave trade called? The triangular slave trade, right? And why was it called the triangular slave trade? It was like a triangle. It went from Europe to Africa, right? That was the first one. And then the next journey was from Africa to the Americas. That was the second part of the journey. And then the last part of the journey was from the Americas back to Europe. And so because this was the middle part of the journey, that's why they call this the middle passage. So this was the first part. They get the European slaveries, right? To start the process, they have the ships, and then they take it to Africa. And then they trade. They traded the guns, they traded the gold, they traded furs, they traded all of this here in Africa for slave labor, right? And then the enslaved Africans that took them and brought this to the Americas. And then this was the middle part of the journey into the Americas, was where they traded those people for money, right? For money, for funds, for whatever else they wanted. And then they took that here, brought it back to Europe, and they were rich, right? And they just continued this journey for centuries and centuries and centuries. So again, that's why this is called the Middle Passage, right? So this is just to give us a little bit of history knowledge on this transatlantic slave trade, in particular the Middle Passage. Again, this is what we call the Ma'afa. Some people say about 12.5 million African people were taken from the continent and brought over to the Americas, all the way up to about 50 million, and even more than that, sure. So again, Ma'afa is the key Swahili word that means the great tragedy or horrific tragedy. That's why we call this the Ma'afa, right? That's the word for these, right? The word that they gave us was the transatlantic slave trade. And again, it refers to the period called the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade. And so the first traumatic experience on this slave trade, the first traumatic experience was first women were separated from their families and women were separated from their children, right? And so when European slavery were brought here to the continent of Africa, they went into inland. And when they went inland, they either came and they ravaged villages, or other African leaders would send people into ravaged villages and then take captive some of their enemies, right? And so the first thing that would happen, the first traumatic experience, is typically they would rip up the family. Why do you think it was so important for them to separate the family?
You can control them over you.
Do what happened?
You can control them better.
You can control them, right? Why you can control them better, but how did they know that you could control? Why was the separation of the families, particularly in the African context?
Because without words, they wouldn't learn from it. So people who are get used.
Right.
So yes, but they were able to have more power and control over them if they were separated, because they can threaten the kids. But I want to highlight that I found out that the majority of the resistance on ships took place when women were at the top of the ships. And so they stopped allowing them to be on the top because the women would, be mutinous and like fight back. And so they started putting them at the bottom of the ships because of that.
So women are part of leading slave revolt.
Yes, correct.
We're getting ready to talk about it in a second.
Yep.
And that's another thing that oftentimes gets overlooked. The significance of women in these slave revolts, the significance of women in the resistance. African women, Black women in the resistance, right? Again, for years and years and years, Europeans were studying African people. They were watching us for centuries, learning our moves. Remember, we talked about this early on. The Europeans weren't new to understanding African people. Europeans weren't new to come into Alexandria and Morocco and the western part of Africa. So they knew and they understood how we work, they understood our culture. One of the things that Europeans knew was that the basis of the African family was the basis of African power was what? The family.
Yeah, the unit
The
together.
family unit, right? No matter how big, you could be as big as Egypt, or you could be as small as the smallest village. The leader was never better than the family. The leader of the country was never stronger than the family unit. So they understood the significance of the family. That's why we have a whole lecture just on that, just on the Black family and the African family. Many people also died of exhaustion on the walk from the interior of Africa to the coast. So we talked about, they talk a lot in history books about the slave coast, as if European slaves just came and it was just a bunch of African people just on the coast waiting for them to come on the boat. But no, most of these people came from inland, and then they had to march all the way from the inland parts of the continent to the coast, right? So they just weren't sitting on the coast waiting, but they just only captured African people that lived on the coast. And so there was a long march, and this march could have been hundreds of miles. Think about walking from here to, I don't know, it was hundreds of miles to Miami, or walking from here to Atlanta, or walking from here to Alabama or Tennessee. That's how long that march was. You're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so a large number of us died just on that march alone.
That's crazy.
Right? Not only that, they just didn't capture men and children, they captured women. Some of these women were what? Pregnant. Some of these women were pregnant. And they had to have their babies on the march. There is historical research that says there were babies that they had to have along the march on their way to the coast.
Say that again.
They were having women were captured right here inland in the African coast, and they had to march to the coast. Some of these women were pregnant. And so they had to make that march, walk from here to Tennessee, pregnant, have the baby, and keep marching. These are the things that our people had to go through. This is not just come and get them and then take them. We have to think about the details and the context of what is happening during these captures. Right? Especially when we talk about the strength of our women. And what you think they did with those after they had those babies. Threw them away like they were trash.
Oh my
Killed the
God.
baby, and that woman got to keep marching all the way to the coast. So that's why a large number of us died before we even got on the slave ship. A large number of us died on that march. There's not a lot of research about that march. There's not a lot. I forgot what it's called. I was looking at the name, but there is a key Swahili name for the march from Italy to the coast. Okay, and then once we got to the coast, then that's when we put on those slave castles. El Amaya, El Mina, and some of those other slave castles that you see now in Ghana and the Sierra Leone, etc. Right? And then, so we talk about the different legs of the journey. The first leg of the journey, again, white men sail to Africa. Right? White men sail to the coast of Africa. Again, this is where they had the things that they were getting ready to sell or to trade African labor for. Again, we talk about guns, silk, jewelry, mirrors, right? Many of these things. So that was the first leg of the journey. And then the middle leg of the journey, again, is what we call the Middle Passage. And I have some notes here about that. But this is where we kidnap men, women, and children were packed, shipped as cargo from Africa to the Americas. Now, one of the things I want to talk about here that a lot of times people may not know is that to get black folks to be a part of this journey, many of the people that were on these slave ships, the white sailors that were on these slave ships, these were not high-class men. These were not men of substance from Europe. Oftentimes, the most desperate work was on the slave ships. And so this was because there was a lot of illness on the slave ships, death on the slave ships, and also they understood that these people were gonna fight back. So you're risking your life every time you go on these journeys. Most of these men that worked on the slave ships didn't want to do it. They were tricked. They were tricked into being sailors, and they were recruited typically by being associated with taverns. So essentially, in Europe, you would have these men, white men, regular guys, who were drunkards. They would go to the taverns, they would go to the bars, and they would go and they would get drunk, and they would order all these drinks. And so what they actually kind of ran this finesse where you would have people that were over these slave ships, they would pay the taverns man to continue to give this man drinks, right? Get him drunk and make him drink more than what he could pay for. And then once he drank more than he could pay for, he couldn't close his tab. The man that ran the tavern would say, well, you can't pay your tab, you gotta go to what? You gotta go to jail. You gotta go to jail, you can't pay your tab. Right? I ain't gonna let you steal from me. So then here comes the slave, the man who was over the slave ship, he would say, hey, you know what? In order for him to pay off his tab, how about he come work for me? He gotta get on this slave ship. It's gonna be a 6-month journey. He gonna come and work for me. And I'll pay his tab. They'll say, okay. And so in order for the man's tab to be paid, now he has to come on this slave ship, he gotta work for the man for 6 months. And that's how they got sailors to be a part of the slave ship, right? Because now he has to work on his tab. That really the man who he's working for actually was the reason why he's on it in the first place. But that man is getting ready to make 3, 4, 5, 6 times that amount. He just being captive on the slave ship. So again, when we're talking about people who are involved in this process, when we're talking about people who are involved in this transition, these are not smart men, these are not men of standard, these are not men of substance, these are old drunk white men that can't pay their bills. And so now they're on the slave ship, and now these are the men that they're getting to come and capture us and take us over into what they call the new world. The trip from Africa to the Americas took about 6 to 9 weeks. 6 to 9 weeks. All right. So by the time we were now put on these ships, and how many of y'all have seen this image before? I'm sure a lot of y'all have, right? I think they showed this image. If you've ever seen, y'all seen School Days? It's like in School Days. I think he has this image right here at the very beginning of the movie School Days. But that is just a picture of how we were put on those ships during the Middle Passage. How we were put on those ships tight, super, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but super tight. Literally next to each other, if you don't mind me saying next to me, brother. Probably about this far apart for 6 to 9 weeks.
Spoon, that's what they call it. Spooning carving ice. Put them in a spoon, back to back.
Exactly. You know how if you're playing with your lady, you're spooning close to her, like that, for 6 to 9 weeks, right? 6 to 9 weeks. And so that's how close we were. So if it was, I believe they said if it was a ship, if it was a boat that held about 200, could fit to capacity 200 people, they would put about 500 African people on those ships. Way more than what they could afford, right? Because they had so many of them on these ships, because they were overcrowding these ships, if you have 200, they comfortably fit 200 and they put 500, what do you think is going to happen to a good number of those African people who are on those ships for 6 to 9 weeks stuck together like that?
Yeah, see, all type of stuff.
Yeah, they're going to die from diseases, they're going to die from sickness, right? Starvation. Some of them starve themselves, right? Just refuse to eat, right? And so when they did that, when they died, what would they do?
Go overboard.
Just throw them overboard. They would just get thrown overboard. right? Sometimes there's actually evidence that there's some historical records that say that there will be times where somebody will pass away, you may be chained to a corpse for 2 weeks because nobody came down to check. So you might be chained to somebody who died 2 weeks ago, and they just sit and they just laying right next to you. Imagine that. Again, same thing that we were talking about with that march to the coast. You also have women who were pregnant on the slave ship. Women who were pregnant on these boats had to deliver babies, chained, while they were on this little passage, right? So this is very important. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Final relation to voyage, slavers stripped their ship's cargo, held the valuable raw materials and sold in Europe. And again, you had different ways in which they were packed. Sometimes they were packed tight like this. Sometimes some slave ships packed them loosely, right? So they had a little bit more room to move around. But most times they were packed really tight, right? And it didn't matter to them how many of them died because they were paid based on how many got on the ship. So they still got paid off of however many they put on the ship. And then if they had to pull some over, it didn't matter because they still got paid. Right? So these were how the taxes and everything ran when it came to slavery. Some of these ships were named after biblical characters. You had ships named Jesus, Moses, Abraham.
Back up just a little bit.
Yes.
But when we're talking about diseases, such on board ships,
Yes.
whenever it's wipe out significant cargo, they would scope the ship because they were insured. Yeah, they would deliberately sink the ship and write off the cargo and collect the insurance.
Wow. Wait, say that one more time. I want everybody to hear.
Sometimes when you have cargoes that were infested with disease and you lost a significant amount of cargo, both slaves died. The scuttle of the ships, they would intentionally sink the ships because everything was insured. So they would sink the ship, all the rest of the slaves, drown the rest of the slaves, and collect the insurance.
Insurance fraud.
Insurance fraud. Yep. Even back then. So again, this is all about money. This is all about money. Again, when we were talking about that, that's why I wanted to start with the slave economy. Right? And this is what we talked about last time. Because many people want to believe that slavery started because of racism. No, racism is a product of capitalism. This was all about money. This wasn't because they hated African people. We talked about this a couple of classes ago as well. In fact, many Europeans deified Africans. They understood how divine these people were. These people had the greatest civilization, the first and the greatest civilization of the man at that time. So they grew on greatness. It wasn't because they hated African people. This was done all based on capital. It was all based on money. And out of that is how we got Jim Crow. Out of that is how we have the racial structure that we have now. It was out of that we have white supremacy that we have now. Right? So these capitalist greedy ideas was what started. Right? They brought up that peace and nations. They were already insured, they were already going to be paid anyway. Right? So again, all about money. This is just an example of just a shackles that were used. And this, I believe, is an adult shackle. I remember one time I went to a museum in Atlanta, and they actually had baby shackles. Talking about very small shackles. They would put on babies, toddlers, right? This is just to let you know the type of mindset, right, these people had. We're talking about the enslavement process. These shackles weren't just for adults; they were for children, babies, 3, 4, 5 years old, right? You all again always like to have a couple of images to show. This is one of the images of Portuguese slave vessels here in East Africa. This was called Fort Jesus. Fort Jesus, built in 1593 at Mombasa by the Portuguese, and it served as their major foothold in East Africa until 1728, when they were driven out under a combined Afro-Arab siege. Right? So this is just an example of one of the slave courts that was used to hold power in enslaved African people before they were put on slave ships. Okay? Why was the Middle Passage such an attractive part of the enslavement process?
Conditions they had to go through, they voyage.
The conditions that they were in, right? The conditions that they had to live through. What else? What did we just talk about? One of the first traumatic experience of the capturing of African people was what?
Break it up with friends.
Breaking up of the family, right? So they knew if we're a family and they know we're a family, they're gonna make sure I get on one slave ship, he gets on what? Another one, and she gets on another one. Because if we're all enslaved together, that's gonna inspire us to do what? That's gonna inspire us to revolt. I see my wife, I see my son, I see my mother, I see my brother on the same slave ship as me. There's absolutely no way you won't be able to keep me. I gotta go. Right? It's something when you see your family members, and you see your family members, you see your brother, your sister, your mama hurt, ain't nothing gonna stop you from not going after that person. Even if you gotta die. But if they split up the family, then you already feel depressed. You already rejected. Now you may just kind of give up, right? Again, not only families, but also villages. People from the same village, people who can speak the same language, right? So I know if I speak the same language as him, it's going to be easier for us to revolt. So they're going to put me on one slave ship, they're going to put him on another. So that I'm speaking a different language from the people on these ships. So think about it. We know that there were revolts. We're going to get to those in a second. We know that there were revolts. These revolts were happening with people who didn't even speak the same language, wasn't of the same ethnicity, wasn't didn't come from the same village. That's just how brilliant we were. That's just how brilliant we were. We were able to stage entire revolts against the Europeans and not even speak the same language as the people we were revolting with. Because we ain't got to speak the same language, you know, clearly you would change, I would change. You got to speak something out. We ain't got to speak the same language, so I figure this thing out. Right? Well, when you move, I move, just like that. I was doing this thing, just like that, right? So, listen, that was the training part. Yes, it was the physical, and yes, it was all that, but it was the emotional, the separation of the family. It was the separation from our people, right?
Part of the middle fast, very crazy here about the Super Bowl season.
Yeah, you got to get that. Go ahead, you go ahead.
Basically, it's like you're saying, the slaves would be so emaciated, from the march. And then the trip across the way, they would take it to central point, feed them, batten them up, so to speak, nurse them back to a certain level of health, so that they would be more valuable.
Yes.
When they got up to, let's say, the Americans.
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. They would fatten them up, and then also they would put oil, they would put grease on their bodies, because of course many of them would beat you, right, or whipped if they chose not to eat, or if they tried to revolt, right? And so by the time they got to the Americas, if they had a lot of whips on their back, whips on their shoulders, they would put I think oil or butter or grease, so that it didn't look like they had all these rips and bruises on them, and so they would look like they were better trained slaves, better trained so-called slaves, right? So that they would be sold for a higher price. Because oftentimes somebody didn't want to buy an enslaved African that had all these rips on them, because they'd be, oh, he gonna be controlled. She must be controlled. I don't know that. So they were often sold at a low price. So yeah, there was that seasoning process of making them look bigger, making them look fat, right? Making them look healthy, right? Making them look like they were obese, so that they could sell them at a higher price. Absolutely. We're gonna talk more about that seasoning process later on, especially in the Caribbean. The Caribbean seasoning process was horrific, way more horrific than it was even to the Americas. We're gonna talk about that in a second. So after the capture, the men were ironed together, and the women and the children were sometimes left unchained in certain states of the weather. And they said that the odor of the African people on these ships, the odor could be detected for at least 5 miles. You could smell the ship coming way before it even got there, right? 5 miles downwind. And again, in order to keep the African people healthy until they got to the slave market in the Americas, the slavers would bring the Africans on deck and they would make them dance. So this is what you were talking about, right? Keeping them healthy, keeping them strong. Because of course, if they're enslaved in those chains for 6 to 9 weeks, what is that going to do to your muscles?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right? What's that going to do to your muscles? What's that going to do to your bones? And so to keep them strong, to keep them healthy and ready to be sold when they got to the Americas, they would take them up to the top deck and they would make them dance. Right? And then they also did that for their entertainment. They did it for their entertainment as well. Right? With 6 to 9 weeks of just being on this boat. Another way in which these European slavers entertained themselves was not only dancing, making African people dance, but also helping themselves to the women, raping the women, raping the African women, bringing them up to the deck, bringing them up to the deck, and doing that.
And the men.
And the men. There's not a lot of research but there's a little bit of research that talks about the boat breaking. Right? A little bit of research that talks about boat breaking. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. Right? But again, these are ways not just to physically, but also psychologically damage us and break down our spirits and break down our mental. But it didn't work. It didn't work for all of us. All right? Let's see. As a slave trade, the food traders used a complex network to tap deeper and deeper into the African continent. So traders would shackle the enslaved people to prevent them to escape. Again, force them to march from their homeland. And again, that journey would last for weeks. The men were ironed together, and the women and children were oftentimes left unchained. And the irons on the men were secured to chains or rods, and the entire deck was covered with them lying there. And they were squeezed so tightly together that the average allowed space, each one was, they say, between 16 inches. And ships that carried about 300 to 500 enslaved people, but had an average height depth of about 5 feet, 5 foot 2 inches. So that's probably about this high. And you're talking about big African men and women, 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", NBA players, right? And now are forced to be in an area that's about 5 foot 2 inches, right? Africans who refused to eat were oftentimes force-fed to eat. And so there was a tube that would be forced down their throat, and they would force them to eat because they would refuse to eat because they were trying to kill themselves by starvation. And so they would put a tube down these brothers and these sisters' throat, and they would force them to eat. Slavers, oftentimes slavers will mutilate their bodies. So if you had some of our people who decided they were going to kill themselves, right, or jump overboard, what the slavers would do, what the European slavers would do, is they would give them, they would either get them from the ocean, or the ones that killed themselves on the ship, they would take their bodies and they would mutilate their bodies. So they would cut off their arms, they would cut off their legs, they would cut off their head, they would cut off their limbs. Why do you think they did that?
Intimidation.
Intimidation.
With mine, keep you like stagnant. So the next person won't even think about it.
When you think about doing it, to let you know who's in power, right? Also, spiritually, we talked about this before. What did African people believe in spiritually when they died? They believed in the afterlife. Right? That's why we took such good care of our dead. That's why we were mummified them. That's why we took such good care. We had to take out the intestines and the heart and all of that. We did that because we believe we have to take care of your body because you're not just going to be healed. You're getting ready to go into the afterlife. So we gotta make sure you go into the afterlife looking good, right? So again, what did I tell you? European slavers knew us, they studied us for centuries and centuries. So they knew what we believed. They said, oh yeah, these people believe in the afterlife. So what we don't do is the ones that kill themselves, we're gonna chop off their head, chop off their feet, their arms, their legs, their limbs, private parts. So they gonna, it's not just affecting them now, also it's gonna affect them in time. They're telling us, we don't just control how you live now, we also gonna control what you live and how you gonna look in the time. Right? So this is some really demonic, spiritually, psychologically, and physically demonic things that were being done because of how much they studied us and how much they understood what we believe, right? And how they try to use this to depower us, right? So important. The outcome of the slave trade also did not prevent this to continue. In 1818, around the early part of the 19th century, because so many people were learning about the slave trade, they were learning how horrific and how inhumane it was. There was much pushback all over the world to end the slave trade. And so eventually, legally, it did, right? Legally, many countries, even in the Americas, they had made it illegal for the slave trade to persist. Right? Not slavery, but the slave trade. That means we couldn't, this middle class is saying you're supposed to go. Do you think it's stopped? No. Absolutely not. There's evidence, there are documents that say they was, all the way up until maybe a couple years before the Civil War, there were slave ships coming along the Mississippi River. All the way up until a few years before the Civil War. So that lets you know that these people, I believe, my cousin did some research on my family, and I believe that my ancestor who was enslaved actually was one of those people that were brought on illegally after the slave trade was supposed to have ended. My great-great-great-grandfather, grandmother that came after, she was one of those ones that came after it was supposed to be done. I believe many of the people that followed the law, that followed the rules that actually didn't, and stopped the slave trade when it was supposed to stop. Right? So thank you so much. Oh, again, please make sure you sign the sheet as well. Karl Marx, the famous economist and sociologist, said that in his influential economic history of capitalism, he said that the turning of Africa into a war for the commercial hunting of black skins signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Slave trade was part of what he termed the primitive accumulation of European capital. Primitive accumulation. The primitive accumulation of European capital. Right? Also, it's very important for us to know that the British, the Americans were not the only ones that were responsible and that were perpetuating the slave trade. In the Atlantic slave trade, the French people were involved as well. One thing we know about African American history is that during Jim Crow in the 1900s, many of our people, especially people who are influenced, whenever we got tired of racism in the Americas, what was one of the places we went to? We went to France. We went to Paris. Right? Who went over there? James Baldwin went over there. Josephine Baker. Right? Du Bois was over there. Right? Whenever we got tired, I think even recently, Tommy East Post was over there for a little while. I think he's at Howard now. He was over there for a little while. So France and Paris has always been, or at least the past 100 years, a place where African Americans would go to get away from the BS heat. Right? But let's not act like they wasn't part of this whole thing as well. French slavery were part of this whole thing as well. And so French interlopers had jumped into the transatlantic slave trade in the early 16th century. And I want to say the Dutch established the first successful French sugar mill in 1655. And during the 1730s alone, the French shipped probably more than 100,000 enslaved people from Africa to the Americas on the sugar plantation. So the French played a huge role in this slave trade. The French turned 4 times as many Africans into enslaved people as the Americans did. 4 times as many African people they turned into slaves, enslaved people. They used them for they used them far more brutally. And the French slavers not only got head start on the Americans, but they continued the slave trade until 1830. They continued the slave trade until 1830, long after the rest of Europe had decided not to. France officially abolished slavery in its colonies only 14 years before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So the French were heavily involved in the slave trade. Heavily involved in the slave trade. And especially in the Caribbean, as we know, the French people were the ones that ruled rich, major black country in the Caribbean. The French ruled what major black country we know of now in the Caribbean? Haiti. Haiti. And if you know anything about slavery in Haiti, it was very ruthless. Very ruthless, right? So during the 8 months sugar harvest, enslaved people sometimes work continuously, almost around the clock. Accidents caused by long hours and primitive machinery were extremely harmful and horrible. North American cotton plantation slavery was actually much less ferocious than the slavery in the Caribbean, and which is one of the reasons why France required a steady flow of thousands of enslaved people a year, because they had to replace the death of all the ones that were happening on the islands. So again, a much more horrific slave conditions than what was happening even in the Americas. By the 1740s, Saint Denis, right, which we know is another name for Haiti, had replaced Martinique as the empire's largest sugar producer. And that year, they had about 117,000 enslaved people that year. That was half of the 250,000 that was in the French West Indies. So they had a large number of enslaved people that was part of that population. Even more than the number of Europeans, the number of French people that lived on the island, which made it a lot easier, made it a little bit more easier for them to revolt, right? The slave population stood at about 460,000 people, which was not only the largest in the island, but also represented close to half of the 1 million enslaved people that were in the Caribbean. Right? The French Assembly even had the equivalent of what we call the 3/5 compromise. Does anybody know what the 3/5 compromise was?
Got 3/5 black people.
That black people are what 3/5 of what? 3/5 of the human being. They had something very similar to that in the Caribbean. Right? They had something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man that stated that men all men were born free, all men were free and equal. But as we know, that was not, it said it, but it didn't actually mean, right? The revolution eventually leads to Saint Denis becoming an independent Republic of Haiti, which eventually led to Haiti being the first independent black state outside of Africa. Okay? So again, like I was saying before, one of the reasons why Haiti was able to be so successful in the slave revolt, because it was so big.
They ain't break the family just like that. Really like they did in America.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was another thing too. In the Americas, when we talk about slavery in the South, typically you would have the so-called slave master in the house with his family, and then who would be on the plantation?
Slaves, overseers.
overseers, African people, right? So the people who own us, so-called owned us, were right there next to us. They could see us, I could see right there in my backyard. But the Europeans were very cocky. It's like they had they were very, very cocky. So they didn't think they had to be on the island. So there was some level of autonomy that Caribbean Africans were able to have more than African Americans. There was a level of autonomy where they were able to kind of continue their own traditions, continue their own religion. They were able to talk amongst each other, to govern amongst each other, to create a culture in the Caribbean that we weren't able to do in the American South because the white man was essentially on my ass right there, looking at us the entire time. So we had to assimilate. They didn't have to as much, right? They didn't have to as much. And so because of that, Europeans or Caribbean African people were able to maintain their religion, they were able to maintain their culture, and it was a little bit easier for them to form and create and successfully implement slavery, right? Not to mention, again, there was so many of them. They outnumbered the white population sometimes 2 to 3 to 1, right? So that's very important for us to realize. And again, a lot of that came from the cockiness, not realizing that we were planning things the entire time, which again led to the Haitian Revolution, which made Haiti the first independent black state outside of Africa. So this is just a quick timeline of the slave trade, right? Just to tell us just a couple of the key dates and key events that happened between 1440 to about 1680. So on the coast of what is now known as some of Morocco, women, this is what we saw, some of the first women that were reported as servants for African captives, for Europeans. About 30 years later, the Portuguese arrived on the Gold Coast. The Portuguese are very important because the Portuguese were the ones that kind of started this whole thing, particularly for the transatlantic slave trade. Started with the Portuguese. The Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, and the British, and the French came over, right? First Portuguese missionaries, they go to Congo, around 1490, and then after 2 years later, you got 1492. What happened in 1492? Christopher Columbus, right? So again, this didn't start with Columbus. We ain't even got to 1619 yet when they say the first Africans came over to the Americas. We ain't even got there yet. This is what we used before that, right? When all of this is going on. So again, the Americans came on, the British in bringing them to the Americas, that was late. It was late. It was 200 years later. Portuguese was already on it. First slave ships to the Spanish colonies in South America was in Spain. The first cargo around 1518. The first cargo of enslaved people to sail directly from West Africa arrived in the West Indies. Around 1559, tobacco from the West Indies was introduced to Europe, and then tobacco became the first major crop grown by enslaved people. Right after that, Queen Elizabeth of England invested about 1,000 pounds into the slave trade, and she got about a 60% profit. So she invested 1,000 pounds, she got a 60% profit. Crazy, crazy money. Shortly after that, that's when Jamestown came about, 1607. That was the first successful colony in the Americas, right? And then 12 years after that is when the first African enslaved people were brought here to the Americas. And then that's when we start to see the American slavery and the American slave system take place, right? So those are just a couple of important dates I think that are important when we're talking about the slave trade in the Americas. So I think another thing that's very important to talk about is not only what was happening on these slave ships, not only the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage, but also slave revolts. Did we just allow this to happen?
No, sir.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We can just allow the fact that, but why is it even important to even talk about revolutions? Why is it even important to talk about revolts?
Should get knowledge yourself, right?
Crime. Knowledge yourself.
Then also to know that these people still walk this earth. Like these people, they still have the same mindset, but it shows in a different fashion.
Yes, sir.
So I think that's why we should keep on talking about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is important because, like you said, these people have these same mindsets. Just because these people who actually participate have died, the mindset is not that. Ideas of white supremacy, the white oppression is not that. And so it's extremely important for us to understand, like you said, brother, that while these things did happen to us, we did not just let it happen. We have always resisted. That's why we're in a place called cafe resistance.
Yes.
We have always resisted. We have always found ways to push back and to push against and to fight. We have never been a people that just lay down and hide.
And I think that they always show this type of torture to like kind of shadow the new ways how they hit us from the mindset.
Oh, absolutely.
So when people speak about slavery, people tend to think about the physical state.
Yes.
And a lot of people talk about the mental.
Yeah.
So that's why now you see it acting out easier because everyone's so focused on the change, like the physical change versus that shackle that physically see.
Absolutely. That's so important because, again, when we look at movements, right?
It's always physical.
It's always the physical. 12 years of slavery, all that kind of thing. Which is why I think Sister said she needs this explanation. That's one of the few movies about enslavement, whether people agree or disagree with politics around the movie. It was one of the few movies I've seen about slavery that dealt with the spiritual oppression and the ways in which slavery robbed us spiritually of who we were. Not just the physical beatings and the rape and all of that, all that is horrific, but the spiritual robbery and the spiritual miseducation that we receive. I never really seen a movie deal with two like that.
I think slavery is more mental than physical.
Absolutely.
They get your mind first and then let's say that and do whatever it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wait. Our bodies can take a lot.
Yeah.
Our bodies can take a lot. Yeah. But somebody, raping your mama or raping your sister right in front of you, that's different. That's worse than any amount of beatings you could ever get.
They put the bag on your head and had you having sex with your mother and her I do not know. The bag on her head and bag on your head.
That's what we did. It's the psychological
Yeah.
damage. It's the emotional damage.
And then the psychological torture, it gets passed down.
Yes.
A lot of people think that some black folks are acting crazy because they're crazy. No, this stuff is passed down.
Hands down.
DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Gene. So, I mean, that's what it is. And then also, I would like to say, physically slavery, that's just one of their weapons. And it's strange how we zoom in that one weapon. There's so many other gadgets that they use cell phone, they use helicopter, they use drone, they use food, social media. You could name it. So this is like a ongoing war. Like this is just what it is. Like we are in war every single day, every second, minute, hour, because they know that we want back what is ours. And then all of us is not gonna just allow.
Yes.
Cause honestly speaking, that never been our nature to just bow down. No.
Yeah.
That never been. That's just the movie telling us.
That's what we see.
Yeah. That's not us.
Absolutely. That's why these revolts are important to talk about. I am one anytime I'm speaking about our story, about our resistance, about our brilliance, our strength, our history, and I'm speaking about the negative aspects of being overpowered or being oppressed. I always think it's important to talk about the resistance of it, so that we show that we never took any of these things like that. We never took any of these things like that. And that's important for us to know because, like you said, these things are passed down, these stories are passed down. And so when we hear from our grandmothers or our grandfathers or our mothers and fathers, and they say, oh, the white person come around, shh, don't say that. That's part of that psychological trauma, that psychological damage. Why do I gotta be white because it's white man? Why my mother told me to cower because I'm in front of white people, right? You know, you can't be acting up with these white people around. For what? Who are they? They don't take no business in your house. They don't take care of me. They don't take care of you. They don't do nothing up there. It's that psychological trauma that they and we teach our children. And now we gotta unlearn this stuff. We gotta unlearn this stuff.
And we need to start teaching our kids about groups like Big for Defense and Robert Williams.
Yes.
Chancellor Williams.
Yeah.
Even Mary Ellis.
Yeah.
He was non-violent, but he was military man. He helped him feel stand right.
Absolutely. Dr. King for a long time.
His house, they say his house got a gun in their room.
Oh yeah. Up until the early 60s. He kept firearms.
Yeah.
Right? And he preached nonviolence, but if you came to his house,
Self-defense.
you know that you had it. Right? Up until I think the early 60s when he finally got rid of his gun. Right? So this is very important. Absolutely important for us to know that 1841. And guess what? Every rebellion was not unsuccessful. There's actually, so I believe it was this 1841 rebellion. There was a story of a rebellion where the slave ship had left the coast. They didn't get very far. Some of the enslaved people got loose from the chains, got on deck, killed almost every white person on at the top deck except for the captain and one other person. Right?
Is that the captain told him to go that way? He thought he was telling him to go back.
Okay, so there is one. That's the homicide.
Okay.
So the homicide was the one where he told him to take him back, but he actually took him to the meet. So that one they did get to the Americans, but this one he actually made him turn the ship around and take him back to Africa. And then he told him he was going to kill the captain, but he said, no, I want you to go back to Europe and I want you to tell them what we need. And that's how that story got out, because he wanted to make sure that this story got told. You better go back and tell them, don't come over here again. You won't get the same thing, right? So again, we did not just sit down and allow these things to happen. And there are other slave ship uprisings, obviously, outside, right? That's something that they moved from. But there were many other slave uprisings and slave ship revolts that happened during this Middle Passage portion, okay? We may not have time to watch this. Okay. If we have time, we can come back to this. But these are a couple more things I want to show you before we wrap up. Timbuktu had a slave trade center. So it was, Timbuktu was what Boston would be today. Way back then, it was the center of education. Right? When you think about Boston, you think about Harvard, Boston College, MIT, some of the what's considered to be the greatest institutions in the world. Timbuktu was that. And then during the slave trade, it became a slave trade center. Right? And they had all of these castles and all of these places that were used to hold enslaved Africans. Right? And then just to give you kind of an idea of where the slave castles were, Denmark, Holland, England, France, Portugal, all were part of this slave trade at different parts of of the 18th and of the 19th centuries. Okay? This is something the brother was talking about earlier, which again I think is very important. And this is the seasoning process. The seasoning process. And is anybody, in addition to what he was saying over the seasoning process?
So I was in South Carolina, a slave market.
Yeah.
And I think it was a section on there where the man was getting my haircut, brushing his teeth, like you say, put oil on him, gave him clean clothes, and got him ready to get on the auction.
Yeah. Trying to get, and that was just one part of it, right? Getting the African people ready to go on the auction blocks. But then another part of it was the mental readiness of African people for this life of enslavement, right? What's going on, brother? For this life of enslavement. And so, again, the tendency to overpopulate the islands of the Caribbean arose from several factors. Many enslaved people were brought into the islands and were re-exported. And so, the view of many masters was that enslaved people were cheaper to purchase than they were to breed. It was easier for us to capture them and trade them than it was for them to put them with other enslaved women and then make enslaved women. That's typically what they did in the American South, right? In the United States, it was more of a breeding situation. In the Caribbean, it was like, no, we just wanted to get more and more and more, right? And so there was evidence of extreme inhumane practices and conditions that Black people were placed under in the West Indies. And on many islands, the African people outnumbered the white folks on these islands. And so these were just a couple of things that I think is important for us to talk about when we talk about the seasoning process. Okay. So in the seasoning process, it says that there seems to be no substantial increase in the African population on the island, and so the death rate was extraordinarily high, that it raised the question of treatment. In 1 year, for example, 2,656 Africans were born in St. Vincent, and in that same year, 4,205 of them passed away in 1 year. In 1 year. That's how many a day. Well, it's 365 days in a year. Right? And so this is why I find it so interesting when people say Black on Black crime has done, so-called Black on Black crime, has done more damage to Black folks than racism. When they talk about gang deaths in Chicago, gang deaths in LA, whatever. Yeah, I have never seen those statistics that show 4,000 Black people killing other Black people in 1 year. I ain't never seen them kind of statistics. At most, they might say 50 gang members or 50 people got killed in Chicago in the summer.
Yeah.
Right? And that's major. Not to say it's not bad. It's definitely bad. 4,000 deaths in 1 year? Insane. So don't let nobody tell you we've done more harm to each other. And this is just one year, 1 week. Don't let nobody tell you we've done more harm to each other than they've done to us. That's absolutely insane. While interracial violence is an issue in our community. Absolutely. And we're going to get there. We're going to talk about gangs and all that other kind of stuff. That's nothing compared to what's going on.
We don't do what they did to us.
We don't do to us what they instilled in us. The type of system that was built for us to have to feel like we have to survive, and we have to unlearn, and we have to get out of this seasoning process. And we have to unlearn and realize and see the value in ourselves based on the devalue that they did on us. So that's why this is extremely important. The islands were of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England if the importation of more slaves meant greater prosperity. And it seems so to the island actors. They were imported with little regard for anything other than the economic consideration. Right? So this is very, very important. Also, what I think is important for us to talk about again is the examples and the conditions that enslaved people were forced under during the seasoning process. And one of the things that oftentimes they were taught, the seasoning process was a time where enslaved people were teaching other enslaved people how to be slaves, how to survive in slavery. Drivers or overseers did not distinguish between men and women when it came to work requirements, so women were working just as hard as men in the fields. Women maintain the same hours as men in the fields and in the mills, and sometimes pregnant women had to work all the way up until childbirth. All the way up until childbirth. Right? When my daughter's mother got pregnant, shortly before work, she was like, I ain't working no more. I can figure this out. I'm about to stop. God. Right? Imagine having to work all the way up and they only had a short amount of time off before guess what they had to be back in the field. Baby strapped on their back. Back in the field. And there was no difference between the men and the women. So if that man is working 18 hours, guess what? That woman can work 18 hours.
She might work 20.
She might have worked 20. Right? Right? Pregnant women were lashed just as severely as the men if they were unable to keep the pace of the other workers. And women who paused in the fields to take care of their babies oftentimes were lashed or whipped because they were seen as wasting time. Right? So again, this is a part of the seasoning process, particularly in the Caribbean, but that right there is actually not uncommon for U.S. slaves today. Right? And then lastly, one of the things that we talked about was the Caribbean, or what is learned was the Caribbean Black Codes. It's kind of, okay, yeah, you can see it better. All right, the Caribbean Black Codes. So have you ever heard of the Black Codes in the Americas? The Black Codes, okay, slave codes, Black Codes. So what are some examples of Black Codes? Y'all remember?
Two or more Negroes together and get arrested.
Railroad track.
Walking down the railroad track? Absolutely.
Reading, like, we couldn't read, like.
Not allowed to read, not allowed to have two or more together. Segregation, right? If you see a white person,
Get off the sidewalk.
outside the road, you can't look them in the eye, you gotta look down, say yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. All that's wrong. The Caribbean, they had codes too. They had black codes in the Caribbean, right? They were not allowed to leave the plantation without a pass. Yep, this was actually very common during apartheid in South Africa as well. Always had to have their pass. Right? Had to have an ID on it. So they couldn't leave the plantation without a pass. They were not to be away on a Sunday under any circumstance. In the Americas, you were allowed to have our Sundays to ourselves. So we had to work 6 days out of the week, and then on Sunday we would go to church and do that. So that was kind of our only time in which we could maintain culture and maintain our own traditions, which is why the Black church is very significant in African American culture. But that was the only time. Yeah, right? On Sundays in the Caribbean, they weren't even allowed to go away, right? They were not allowed to carry any weapons. And if an enslaved person struck a so-called Christian, he was to be severely whipped. And then the second offense, he was to be branded with his face with a hot iron. And these were, again, the Caribbean Black codes. If the so-called owner of the Black person was accidentally hit, that slave would be chopped to death. He was subject to fire imprisonment. The enslaved people were found guilty of revolt and were cruelly executed. Right? This is how they were executed. Their arms, thighs, legs, and backbones were broken. They would be fastened to a round wheel in such a manner that their face was turned upward to the sun, and then they would have to sit there, and here they were to remain for so long as they pleased the so-called master to have them alive. And then after that, after the so-called master was done with them, then they would chop their heads off, and they would expose their heads in tall poles to let the rest of the people in the island know what would happen if you revolted. And you were talking about and psychological damage. Okay? One important ingredient in the seasoning process was the whip, the overseer's ladder. So a typical one was kind of braided, right? They were braided, very similar to the braiding like they had in Nine Tails, and they used the whip Jesus, right? Very similar to that. It would be braided. And at times, the whippings were so bad and so severe that they said you would put a man's finger inside of the whip. That's just how deep the gash was. You could put a whole finger inside inside the whip.
I was in the room. That's why we call the white man black. Because
Yeah.
when
It was a practice whip.
it was practice.
Right.
That's
Right.
how they say that.
Yeah, I've heard that. I'm not sure. I actually be good. I mean, I can see that. But yeah, I've definitely heard that story before. That was one of the reasons why we call like those practice. Another favorite type of punishment was to suspend a slave from a tree by ropes and tie iron weights around his neck and waist. Another was to crop the enslaved person's ears off to break their bones. Another part of the seasoning process was burning, whipping, and hanging enslaved people. It was all very, or they thought it was extremely important in a society where black people outnumbered the whites so severely. And so to continually oppress them, to continually keep them in an inferior position, this was why the slavery and the condition of slavery was so much worse on the islands. In some ways, it was worse on the islands than it was on even in the American South. The enslaved man lived, if the enslaved man lived, he was regarded as seasoned within 3 or 4 years after he first got to the island. So after he first got to the island and we go through the seasoning process, the white man said it probably took him about 3 to 4 years. But after 3 to 4 years, then they felt like the African was properly seasoned and had been taught and learned out, psychologically damaged, and traumatizing them to now be a proper slave, right? And so, and this was much more desirable than what they said, the raw African that they got in Africa, the one that was truly understood his humanity and was so used to his humanity before being seasoned and being assimilated into this enslavement process. Okay? So with that being said, that is the end of this lecture where we talk about the passage, the African Holocaust. The next time, actually our next lecture, we're going to talk about Kwanzaa. So we're going to talk about the holiday of Kwanzaa, where Kwanzaa came from, that part of our culture and our history. And then after that, we're going to start talking about what life was like in the Americas, on the plantation, in the African American story, and we're going to continue in that regard. These are some references here that you can look at some more of this information what we talked about, and also if you want to contribute to the class and contribute to what we have here at our institute, feel free to donate through the cash app there.
African
Oh,
Holocaust.
you ain't got to stand up. I got it. You got it.
Dr. John Henry Clark.
Yes.
In the will.
Dr. John Henry Clark, you can add that to these references as well. John Henry Clark, African Holocaust as well. And if you know of any other references or any other books or articles, feel free to mention that as well. You can even send it on the email section. That being said, thank y'all so much for being here, and now we will be transitioning to our next.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, always.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad it's working.
Yeah, I was at home looking at it.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah. How the fight's been going?
Oh man, great.
Yeah.
I just lost the decision. In Africa.
Uh-huh.
But,